Welcome back to the channel. Today, we dive into one of the darkest and most terrifying chapters in human history, a period where fear ruled the courts, superstition replaced reason, and thousands were condemned to flames and torture for crimes that never existed. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, do you believe fear can justify cruelty? Could such hysteria ever happen again today? Make sure to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts on what kind of historical, horror, or dark-themed stories you want me to cover next. Your engagement fuels the next deep dive. Now, prepare yourself. This is not just history. This is a warning carved in fire.
Ashes of Suspicion, early 15th century. Approximately 20,000 to 25,000 words worth of content will be delivered in multiple messages across the 6 parts. Below is a long-form beginning appropriate to system limits. Winter, in the early years of the 1400s, fell across Central Europe with a weight that felt almost purposeful. Snow blanketed villages in thick white silence, muting the sounds of animals, children, and even thought. In this cold world of rigid survival, where religion and fear walked hand in hand, the smallest deviation, an unexpected illness, a livestock death, a strange dream, could ignite suspicion faster than fire in dry timber. It is here, in a cluster of small Germanic villages, cradled between dark pine forests and snow-capped ridges, that our story begins.
The Whisper Beneath the Snow. Elizabeth Hoffman was not unusual. A woman of 38 winters, with a lined face and hands cracked from constant labor, she moved through life unnoticed. She tended her garden, sold herbs, and nursed sick children when their desperate mothers asked for help. None of these acts were extraordinary, until an illness struck the livestock of her village during the coldest week of January. Cows died, horses weakened, chickens lay lifeless in frost-caked stacks. The villagers whispered. Fear trembled through streets. Snow swallowed their steps, but not their suspicions. Elizabeth's fate was not sealed by her actions, but by the need for someone, anyone, to blame.
The first accusation. The pastor, Father Marcus, carried more authority than most kings within these frozen wooden houses. A thin man, wrapped in layers of wool, he preached sermons about sin, repentance, and the devil's presence in all suffering. He had lost a brother to fever 20 years earlier, and since then he viewed every misfortune as a spiritual warning. When the livestock plague hit, he looked for patterns. He found Elizabeth, too knowledgeable about herbs, too confident in her remedies, too independent. The first accusation arrived like a whisper carried on a cold wind. The herb woman has brought the curse. Fear made the ground fertile for superstition. The gathering storm. Snow fell for 3 days without pause. During that time, rumors metastasized.
A child's fever worsened. A woman miscarried. A traveler claimed he saw Elizabeth speaking to a raven beneath the old frost-covered willow, a tree known for ancient legends older than Christianity. Fear amplified every detail, shaping them into a narrative of witchcraft. By the end of the 3rd night, a mob had gathered on the pastor's command. Torches lit the snow in golden fire. Shadows danced against barns and cottages. Elizabeth was seized. Her crime: existing at the wrong time. Knowing too much. Being needed, yet never embraced. The frozen cell. Elizabeth was dragged to the village's small holding cell, a stone structure half buried in the ground, its interior always cold. Snow blew through cracks. Water froze in thin sheets along the walls. She prayed.
Not to the devil, whom she did not believe in, but to the God who had gone silent. Inquisitors were summoned. Her neighbors crossed themselves when her name was spoken. The road to interrogation. 2 weeks later, Inquisitor Matthias arrived from a nearby town, a man hardened by years of rooting out heresy, or what he believed heresy to be. He wore a heavy cloak lined with fur and carried documents signed by ecclesiastical authority. The trial began with theological questioning, then with forced confessions, then with tests. The cold made everything worse. Elizabeth nearly froze before she was accused of surviving the cold unnaturally, which only fed the accusations further.
The spark of a century of fire. Elizabeth's case became the first official witch trial recorded in the region, setting a precedent that would echo for generations. Her conviction, constructed from fear, ignorance, and pastoral authority, spread to other towns. By the time of her execution, more accusations were already swirling. Within weeks, neighboring villages reported their own suspects. Inquisitors began traveling more frequently. New guidelines were drafted for identifying witches. The machine of persecution, slow at first, had begun turning its gears. And all of it began under bright winter sunlight, reflected on snow that seemed too pure to witness such terror.
The snow-filled hammers of justice, late 15th century. The death of Elizabeth Hoffman in the early 1400s had been a spark, barely noticed outside her valley, barely recorded in any official ledger. But sparks in winter can become avalanches. By the late 15th century, what began as isolated accusations had transformed into a social mechanism, a culture, a weapon. The world had changed. Populations grew, then stagnated. Religious authority deepened its grip. Wars and famine left people desperate. Fear became the shadow that walked with every citizen from sunrise to sunset. And as Europe entered another cycle of brutal winters, the witch hunts spread across borders like frost creeping over glass.
This part follows the rise of institutionalized witch hunting, fueled by manuals, theologians, political pressures, and a growing list of legal procedures that turned mere rumor into ritualized persecution. We return to our interconnected setting: snowy alpine villages, dark pine forests, small ecclesiastical towns, and to the descendants of those who once whispered Elizabeth's name. The winter of manuals and mandates. In 1486, decades after Elizabeth's death, a document emerged that would reshape Europe's judicial landscape, a witch-hunting manual penned by two Dominican inquisitors. It traveled fast, faster than reason, faster than compassion. Priests carried it into mountain villages, magistrates copied its passages, towns adopted its warnings as divine truth.
The manual's arrival in the region where Elizabeth once lived was marked by the coldest winter in 40 years. Snowdrifts rose higher than door frames, rivers froze solid, wolves came down from the mountains. Superstitions flourished in conditions like these. When a series of fires erupted mysteriously in the nearby town of Grauberg, suspicion turned immediately toward women who lived alone, widows who tended goats, herbalists who had survived the last great famine. The manual's guidance gave structure to fear. Where misfortune multiplies, the devil walks in flesh. The villagers believed it because they needed to. Martha Hirsch and the burden of memory. Among the first accused in this new surge was Martha Hirsch, a distant descendant of Elizabeth's sister. Martha lived in a modest wooden house at the edge of the pine forest, where snow collected thickly on the roof each winter. She kept few belongings, a few blankets, dried herbs, a small copper kettle. She had no husband, no children, no surviving parents. She had skills in healing, as Elizabeth once did, and as fate often twisted, she inherited her ancestors' quiet nature. In a world now trained to fear women who lived alone, Martha was marked long before she realized it. The villagers watched her every step, how she greeted the woods, how she fed the ravens, how she sang softly to herself while gathering pine resin. None of these actions were unusual, but fear transforms the ordinary into the diabolical. When a miller's son fell sick, eyes turned toward her.
When a horse broke its leg, whispers followed.
When the manual's teachings arrived, Marta's fate sealed itself like frost on window glass. A village divided. Grauberg had always been a simple place. Wooden homes clustered along a river, a church tower rising above snow-covered rooftops. But fear splits communities like axes split logs. Some villagers urged caution. She has harmed no one. Others insisted, the devil hides in plain daylight. The pastor, newly educated and zealous, leaned heavily on the manual. He preached fiery sermons about temptation and infiltration of communities. Snow fell gently on the congregation as they huddled in the churchyard, breath steaming like smoke. Every Sunday, the pastor's warnings grew sharper. Every week, suspicion deepened.
By midwinter, Grauberg was ready to purge itself. The arrest. On a blindingly bright afternoon, sunlight reflecting violently off snow, the magistrate, accompanied by 3 armed men, approached Marta's home. She was stirring a pot of herbs over a small fire. The smoke carried a pleasant smell of pine and mint. When the men entered, she did not run. Instead, she asked, "Is it illness? Who needs help?" But they didn't come for healing. A sealed document was read aloud. The manual's words echoed through the cabin. Neighbors watched from behind trees, their faces pale in the winter glare. Marta was taken. Her home was searched. Her herbs, common, harmless, were labeled devilish concoctions.
The ravens that followed her through the forest screamed into the sky as she was dragged toward the village jail. The instruments of law. Unlike Elizabeth, whose trial was shaped by superstition and untrained fear, Marta faced a more sophisticated, more dangerous enemy, a fully formalized legal system built for witch persecution. Interrogation chambers had been expanded, written procedures existed, confessions, torture protocols, and theological logic had been standardized. Inquisitor Reinhardt, who presided over the region's investigations, believed deeply in the manual's teachings. He interpreted silence as guilt, tears as manipulation, and resistance as proof of devil's influence. Marta tried to explain her herbs. She tried to plead her innocence.
And the machine of persecution, now efficient, documented, and systematized, was unstoppable. The cold winters preserved the memory of these events like ice trapping leaves. Snow fell on graves, fields, and pyres alike. Each sparkle of sunlight on frost felt like a reminder of all the lives taken. Marta's death echoed far beyond her lifetime, shaping the destinies of thousands who would follow.
The Frost Kingdom of Confession, early 16th century. By the dawn of the 1500s, witch hunts had mutated from localized panic into a system that moved with the weight of a continental machine. Courts, clergy, and civic officials all reinforced one another, forming an iron triangle that crushed dissent beneath it. This century would be known not for its progress, but for its perfected cruelty. Fear had become policy. Rumor had become evidence. Torture had become the principal language spoken by the courts. Snow continued to blanket the alpine regions where Elizabeth and Marta once lived, but now the winter seemed to mimic the new order of justice, beautiful on the surface, lethal beneath.
This chapter traces the industrialization of the witch hunting process, the rise of professional interrogators, and the emergence of confessions crafted under duress. It also follows several individuals caught in the machine, some accused, some complicit, all transformed by the cold. The codification of fear. By the 1520s, nearly every township in the region had adopted formal protocols for witch trials. These were not random accusations, but structured events, complete with standardized testimony forms, official interrogation sequences, approved torture devices, sanctioned theological reasoning, mandatory public confessions. Each case, once opened, was nearly impossible to close without a conviction.
Officials argued that the devil hid within procedural gaps, so the procedure must be airtight, unyielding, merciless, thorough. Villagers learned to fear paperwork more than curses. A signature could doom a family. A seal on a document could extinguish a life. In this era of administrative terror, the winter's biting cold felt almost gentle by comparison.
He arrived in Grauberg one winter morning on horseback, steam rising from the animal's nostrils as the sun glowed weakly behind snow clouds. Villagers saw him and lowered their eyes. Children were pulled indoors. Doors latched shut. Bremer represented a new breed of official, the kind trained not just in law, but in psychology, anatomy, and the breaking of will. With his arrival, accusations increased as though his presence alone encouraged them. The case of Jakob and Line Amsberg. Not all accused were loners or herbalists. Some were ordinary villagers, whose misfortune simply aligned poorly with rumor. Jakob Amsberg was a carpenter, respected, skilled. His wife, Line, was known for her generosity.
They lived in a sturdy home near the central square, with a workshop facing the snowy road. In early winter, their infant daughter died suddenly during a freezing night. They buried her beneath heavy snow. 2 days later, a neighbor claimed Line had spoken strangely near the grave. Another insisted he had seen Jakob wandering the woods at night. Baseless statements, but in a climate of fear, they transformed into allegations. Within a week, the Amsbergs were accused of binding winter spirits, mourning improperly, practicing nocturnal rites, causing their own child's death with curses. Bremer oversaw their interrogations. Under torture, Jakob admitted to walking at night because grief had kept him from sleep. This statement became confession of consorting with darkness. Line screamed her innocence so loudly the guards covered their ears. Her voice was catalogued as supernatural strength. Both were sentenced. Their workshop remained empty, snow piling against its door, tools rusting. The spread of procedural persecution. The Amsberg case became a template, cited in courts across the region. Villages replicated the structure. Anonymous testimony. Immediate detainment. Forced confession. Public demonstration of guilt. Execution. Officials claimed this uniformity made justice more reliable. In reality, it made cruelty efficient. A widow in Hohendorf was executed after confessing, under torment, to causing hailstorms. A young man in the valley below Grauberg admitted to flight, simply to end the pain. Entire families vanished from community records. The new procedures created a conveyor belt of death, each life processed through cold legal machinery. The winter of endless trials. In 1537, the region endured a brutal winter known as the White Silence. Temperatures plunged so low that lakes froze solid enough to support horses and carts. Snowfall was relentless, burying barns and collapsing roofs. With hardship came blame. Over 36 people were charged with witchcraft in a single season. Trials were held in barns when the jails overflowed. Executions took place on frozen hillsides, the flames struggling against the icy wind. Children memorized the names of the condemned as though reciting cautionary tales.
Bremer and other interrogators worked tirelessly, traveling across snowbound roads, carrying ledgers filled with confessions extracted from trembling prisoners. By spring, when the melt finally came, villages discovered bones beneath the receding snow, remnants of bodies buried hastily in frozen earth. A growing resistance in whispers. Amid all this brutality, whispers of resistance began to circulate. A small number of clergy quietly questioned the procedures, noting that the confessions were too similar, too structured, too convenient. Some scholars attempted to challenge the manuals, arguing that torture produced falsehoods. But dissent was dangerous. Anyone who criticized the courts risked suspicion themselves.
Thus the resistance moved underground, spoken softly behind closed doors, in candlelit rooms where frost crept down windows and winter winds howled through the eaves. These whisperers were few, but their doubts grew. Their questions multiplied, their courage strengthened. And in the decades to come, their voices would become a force the witch-hunting machine could no longer ignore. For now, however, the snow-covered world remained locked in fear.
The fires under the snow, mid-16th century. By the mid-1500s, witch hunts had become something far more formidable than regional hysteria. They had become an institution, no longer sporadic, no longer dependent on one preacher's sermon or one village's misfortune. The system had matured, wrapped itself in legal authority, and marched across Europe with the discipline of an empire. This era is defined by three rising forces: the legal armature, new courts, manuals, and judges trained exclusively to pursue witchcraft; the professionalization of persecution, scribes, torturers, and informants who earned livelihoods from accusation; the expansion of scapegoats. Everyone, from widows to midwives to healers, now formed a pool of potential suspects.
Snow still clung to rooftops, forests, and mountains, as if winter itself bore witness to the transformation. Across these frozen landscapes, people lived with the awareness that a single rumor could end a life. This part follows the spread of trials into larger towns, the escalation of punishments, and the slow, dangerous rise of resistance among educated elites. The machinery expands, witch chambers and tribunal halls. By 1540, cities no longer conducted trials in improvised barns or overcrowded jails. Instead, specialized facilities were erected: witch chambers, interrogation halls, and tribunal rooms crafted solely for processing accusations.
These chambers were cold, stone-walled, and dim, yet shafts of bright winter sunlight streamed through narrow slits high above, illuminating drifting ice crystals. Warm paint tones and tapestries contrasted eerily with the bleak reality inside. Within these rooms, testimonies were recorded on specialized forms. Devil's marks were cataloged with anatomist precision. Confessions were extracted in standardized sequences. Courts expected torture as a procedural norm. Cities justified the cost of these new buildings by arguing that witchcraft threatened commerce, stability, and divine favor. The irony was cruel. Economic hardship, often caused by harsh winters and failed harvests, now fueled accusations that the courts claimed to remedy.
The rise of the informant guilds. In the shadows of these courts emerged a new social class, the informants. Some were opportunists hoping for coin. Some were zealots convinced they served God. Some were desperate villagers trying to preempt suspicion by accusing others. Guilds of informants formed inside taverns and hidden warm-lit cellars, meeting while snowstorms howled outside. They compared notes, shared methods, discussed rumors, and refined the art of accusation. Their identities were often protected, giving them dangerous power. One name began to circulate widely across the region: Matthias Cromer, known as the Listener, because he claimed to overhear the devil's whispers in the words of others.
Cromer traveled from town to town, wrapped in a long ochre cloak that contrasted sharply against bright, snow-glittering landscapes. His accusations were precise, devastating, and almost always believed. The midwives and healers become targets. As trials expanded, a grim new pattern emerged. Women in healing professions became primary targets. Midwives, herbalists, and caretakers were accused of controlling life and death, interfering with divine judgment, having secret knowledge, crafting potions not sanctioned by Scripture. In reality,
They were simply women whose expertise threatened clerical authority. One such woman was Gertrude Wilse, a midwife of 30 years who had delivered hundreds of infants.
She lived in a warm timber home at the edge of town, surrounded by snow-laden pines. Children adored her. Mothers trusted her. But when a series of winter stillbirths struck the region, fear sought a vessel. Cromer arrived. He watched. He listened. A neighbor claimed Gertrude had muttered a curse while grinding herbs. Another insisted she had unnatural calm in moments of crisis. Her practice of warming herbs over sunlight-reflecting mirrors in the snow was twisted into ritualistic behavior. She was arrested. Her trial drew crowds who once greeted her warmly in the marketplace. She refused to confess. Days later, under torture, she broke, muttering fragmented sentences that the tribunal stitched into a full confession.
Her execution became a spectacle, the pyre crackling weakly under a snowfall that muffled the crowd's cheers. The witch storm cases of 1552. In 1552, an unprecedented weather event struck the Alpine valleys, a cluster of violent blizzards, sudden thaws, and flash freezes that destroyed crops and livestock. This period became known as the witch storm winter. The courts declared the storms unnatural. Clergy cited them as evidence of coordinated malefic forces. Informants accused nearly 60 individuals in one season. Huge lists of malefactors were posted in sunlit squares where snow swirled at people's feet. Each name represented a neighbor, a relative, a friend.
The witch storm trials were distinguished by group interrogations, mass confessions, collective pacts fabricated by scribes, synchronized executions. It was said that the sky looked red on some mornings, sunlight diffusing through frozen fog like a wound. The ethical crisis among educated men. Amid the violence, a quiet intellectual rebellion began. Scholars, physicians, and even a handful of clergy questioned the logic of the trials. They gathered in private libraries warmed by stoves, while snow blanketed rooftops outside. Figures like Dr. Leonhard Eben, a physician trained in anatomy, argued that devil's marks were natural blemishes and birthmarks. He insisted torture produced meaningless answers. Young theologians, influenced by early humanist thinking, wrote treatises warning that the courts had become engines of falsehood. But publishing such ideas was dangerous. Many wrote under pseudonyms. Some fled cities, others vanished once their manuscripts were discovered. Still, the intellectual resistance grew quietly, like embers beneath snow. The collapse of trust. By the late 1550s, entire communities were defined by suspicion. Families avoided one another. Neighbors closed shutters during winter storms, refusing to offer aid lest it be interpreted as collusion. Children learned to fear anyone alone, old, or skilled. Marriage prospects shrank. Commerce slowed. Workshops emptied. Churches filled with whispers instead of hymns.
What bound people together was no longer faith or kinship. It was shared fear. And beneath that fear, something else moved. A dawning realization that the witch-hunting system had become too powerful, too hungry, too entrenched. The stage was set for the next escalation, a period where entire regions would begin burning hundreds at a time, not because they found witches, but because they needed someone to blame. This was the eve of the Great Fires.
The Great Purges, when entire regions burned. Late 16th century. By the final decades of the 1500s, the witch hunts reached their most devastating form. Everything Europe had built during the prior century, legal machinery, informant networks, theological justifications, interrogation methods, now converged into a single catastrophic period historians would later call the Great Purges. These were no longer isolated incidents, no longer small-town panics. They were coordinated exterminations that swept across principalities, bishoprics, alpine valleys, and river cities. The bright sunlight reflecting across endless fields of snow did nothing to warm the cold rationality behind the destruction.
If anything, the beauty of winter made the violence feel even more surreal. Fires burning beneath a sky glowing gold over white landscapes. This is the moment when fear became governance and accusation became identity. The prince-bishops and the politics of purity. Across Central Europe, a new breed of ruler emerged, the prince-bishop, a man who commanded both secular and spiritual authority. These rulers claimed divine duty to purge all demonic influence from their lands. Their courts were financed through increased tithes, special taxes, and even confiscated property. In many territories, witchcraft became not only a spiritual crime, but a civil offense, a threat to the political body itself. The Prince-Bishop of Falkenberg, Erhard von Hogenstam, became infamous.
He rode through his snow-covered territory in richly colored robes lined with fur, sunlight glinting off the embroidery, his entourage leaving deep tracks in frosted earth. Wherever he traveled, accusations surged. Villagers whispered that his arrival was a herald of death. Under his rule, more than 400 people were executed in 6 years. The architecture of fear, special tribunals and fire courts. During the Great Purges, many cities erected fire courts, tribunals designed to process accusations rapidly and efficiently.
They operated in newly constructed buildings, large stone halls, elevated interrogation platforms, sealed confession rooms, snow-lit judges' chambers, maps of entire territories marked with pins representing infection sites. These courts ran year-round, but winter became their busiest season. Frozen ground made burials difficult, so executions were often postponed until snow melted, resulting in mass burnings during the first warm days of spring. The sunlight of these seasons became terrifying, illuminating rows of pyres lined neatly across thawing fields. The Würzburg fires, children accused. One of the darkest chapters in this era occurred in the city of Würzburg, where even children were accused, interrogated, and executed. In 1590, during a winter of ice storms, several children claimed to have seen night riders in the snow, shadowy figures shaped by fear and imagination. Informants seized upon these stories. Within weeks, dozens of children were arrested as alleged apprentices of the devil. Interrogations of children were conducted in sunlit chambers where bright winter light made their tears shimmer. Unable to withstand pressure, they accused one another. Those who named no one were tortured. It was said that the snow outside the prison courtyard turned pink during the final days, reflecting both sunset and the blood spilled from beatings.
The Snow Chronicles, documenting the purges. One of the few surviving records of this era came from Magister Ulrich Brenner, a teacher who witnessed the trials and secretly compiled what he called the Snow Chronicles. He wrote by candlelight in his frost-covered study, windows glowing with bright winter light. His writings described the daily fear residents lent under, the manipulations of informants, the coerced confessions, the piles of seized property, the routine cruelty of fire courts, the psychological devastation among the innocent. He wrote, "The snow hides the faces of the condemned, but their voices remain trapped beneath it. When spring returns, their spirits rise with the thaw."
His manuscript was discovered decades later and remains one of the most chilling documents from the era. The Heretic's Pyre in Falkenberg. In 1597, under Erhard von Hogenstam, the town of Falkenberg conducted the largest single execution in its history. After months of accusations, sparked by a series of blizzards and sudden cattle deaths, over 60 people were condemned. On the morning of the executions, bright sunlight spilled across fresh snow, turning the entire field into a blinding expanse of white. Villagers said the scene felt like a cathedral of ice, the sky crystal clear above rows of stakes. The fires, once lit, struggled against the cold wind, and it took hours for the pyres to fully consume their victims.
The smoke rose in columns, drifting across snowy hills like storm clouds. The event became known as the Heretics' Pyre. That winter, many families fled the region permanently, leaving homes half buried in snow. The birth of open rebellion. By the late 1590s, the violence finally became too great to ignore. Three forces began pushing back. Local communities refusing to cooperate with informants. Merchants and guild leaders who saw commerce collapsing under the weight of fear. Educated elites who recognized that the witch hunts were destroying the very fabric of society. Secret gatherings took place in warm tavern back rooms, snow piling against the doors. Whispers became discussions. Discussions became plans. Plans became resistance.
Some villages barricaded their gates against roaming informants. Others sheltered the accused in barns, hiding them behind stacks of hay and snow-covered farm tools. The witch-hunting establishment saw this defiance as proof of growing demonic influence, which only intensified their purges. The road toward the century's end. As the century closed, a contradiction defined the era. Europe was entering the age of reason, science, and early Enlightenment thought, and yet it simultaneously burned thousands as witches. Snowy fields across Central Europe carried the remnants of these contradictions, bright sunlight glistening across frozen earth, where ash from executions mixed with the ice. The great purges were nearing their height, but they had not yet reached their end.
The next chapter would reveal the breaking point, when fear exhausted itself, when courts overreached, when skeptics gained ground, and when Europe finally began to awaken from the fever that had consumed it for 2 centuries.
The last embers of winter, the quiet after the storm. Winter loosened its grip on the valley in reluctant fragments, as though the land itself feared what might surface when the snow melted. The tribunals had finally ceased issuing decrees. The fire courts were shuttered by order of distant rulers whose patience with ecclesiastical chaos had snapped. The pyres cooled, but the people did not feel liberated. Instead, a colder, more silent tension settled over them, quiet, suffocating, and heavy with memory. Ulrich Brenner, now gaunt from sleepless months of secret writing and evasion, walked through the half-thawed marketplace.
He felt the ghost of last winter in every corner, the empty stalls of merchants who had fled, the boarded homes of those executed, the church doors sealed with new proclamations promising renewed mercy. As Ulrich observed the remnants of snow clinging to the cobbles, he realized the land was not healing, it was holding its breath. Those who had survived refused to meet anyone's eyes. Children who once played with snowballs now walked silently at their parents' side. The rhythm of village life had collapsed into a dull, weary march. Only the ravens remained unchanged. They perched along rooftops, watching the living with the patient confidence of creatures that had outlasted every calamity.
The Prince Bishop falls. News spread through the region like wind chill. The Prince Bishop, architect of the Great Purges, had been recalled. The Imperial Council, exasperated by the economic devastation, had intervened. Merchants petitioned the emperor, foreign diplomats lodged formal complaints, and scholars risked everything to submit evidence of fabrications, coerced confessions, and mass judicial fraud. For the first time in years, the Prince Bishop stood before a tribunal, but this time as a defendant. The charges were worded cautiously: administrative overreach, misappropriation of civic property, excessive disciplinary measures, but everyone knew what they meant. He was stripped of authority.
He departed in a gilded carriage, accompanied only by a few loyal guards, leaving behind the ruins of an empire of fire he had built with ruthless conviction. Some villagers threw frozen stones as the carriage passed. Others bowed their heads, not in respect, but to avoid being seen celebrating. The snow began to fall again that morning. but softly, like an exhausted sky that no longer had the strength for blizzards. The collapse of the informant system. With the prince bishop gone, informants scattered like birds startled from a field. Matthias Cromer, the listener, found himself suddenly unwelcome. People who once feared him now chased him from their doorsteps. The tribunal hall no longer needed his services. The new governor declared the practice of paid accusations illegal.
The old records were sealed, locked behind heavy iron bars. Cromer tried to burn his notes, but the village seized him before the fire could catch. Some demanded vengeance, others suggested mercy. In the end, they exiled him, without payment, without protection, and without the cloak that once symbolized his power. He walked away into the snowstorm alone, his footsteps fading into the vast white blankness that swallowed all memories of those who had lived by deceit. The survivors speak. The survivors gathered in the central square at dusk. Ulrich stood at the outskirts, clutching the manuscript that had nearly cost him his life. A small circle formed around him, mostly widows, some clergy who had resisted, and children now suddenly burdened with the histories of their parents.
Ulrich read from the Snow Chronicles, not the full manuscript, for its pages were too dangerous, too raw, too incriminating. But he read of the lies encoded into testimonies, the methods of pressure, the false signs mistaken for evidence, the children forced into confessions, the judges rewarded for speed, not accuracy, the hunger that drove many to betray neighbors, the fear that spread faster than any flame. As he read, snowflakes sparkled in the warm evening sunlight. The words seemed to drift upward with them, scattering across the village like embers that refused to die. No one spoke for a long time after he finished. Finally, a young girl asked, "Will they come back?"
Ulrich looked at her, the daughter of a midwife who had been burned last winter, and answered with painful honesty, "Yes, somewhere, someday. Fear always returns. But if our memory stays awake, the fire does not have to." The winter of reckoning. The new authorities issued pardons for the dead. Confiscated property was theoretically restored, except most of it was gone, sold, or stolen. Trials were formally annulled, and yet none of this reversed the damage. People rebuilt homes together. They carved names of the executed into wooden plaques. They reopened frozen wells and scrubbed soot from abandoned worksheds. The church bells tolled in mourning rather than condemnation. But guilt poisoned the soil. Neighbors who had accused each other now worked side by side.
Priests who had preached judgment now preached repentance. Children who had testified now carried the weight of innocence stolen. The winter light seemed different, warmer, gentler, but fragile. One morning, the sky blazed gold on fresh snowfall, illuminating the valley in ethereal brightness. It was the first sunrise that did not feel haunted. The last embers. Years passed. Ulrich's Snow Chronicles circulated quietly, copied in hidden rooms by candlelight. Scholars across Europe debated them. Some praised the bravery of the account. Others dismissed it as exaggeration. A few called for reform. But his final chapter was not about law or doctrine. It was about people. He wrote of a midwife named Gertrude, whose kindness had outlived her death.
He wrote about children who learned the cost of fear. He wrote about farmers who rebuilt fields scorched by the pyres. He wrote about priests who rediscovered mercy. He wrote about villages that survived more than winter. And he wrote about the last ember, the memory that refused to fade. For memory was the only force capable of breaking a cycle older than the snow. Epilogue: The Thaw. One spring morning, a young boy found a charred stake half buried beneath melting snow. Instead of throwing it aside, he carried it to the center of the village and placed it at the base of the memorial plaque. The villagers gathered around it. No speeches were made. No rituals were performed. The sun rose, warming the valley until the frost began to shine like thousands of small stars.
The witch hunts were over.
But their lessons, etched into the land, the people, and the snow, would endure longer than any winter.